Pink one. I was looking at you. I don't want to wear it since I said question.
Oh, fuck no, we have not.
Oh, you know what? Sorry, use the Congress was like, yeah, I needed a logo.
Oh, we're live. All right. We're ready to roll. We've got the live stream going. We've got our presenters here. Most of our presenters are here in the building, so that's great. We'll get going. We've got about 45 minutes or an hour of talks and then a bit of a break, and then I think we're coming back in after that, aren't we? So yeah, brilliant. Well, I'm going to hand over to who's talking up first?
That's me.
Tom. Go for it, Tom.
All right. Oh, there's
Camera's up here. Yeah.
that's like kind of look at the screen like, where's mine? All right. This is an awkward presentation. Hi. Hello, everyone in person, which is great to see. Some people turned out despite what is pretty awful weather. And hello to the internet. We'll have some amount of people watching there at some point. Really tall. Thanks everyone for coming. Big thanks to our sponsors, so Credits and Smira Post, who are hosting us physically here tonight. Bit of a novelty with COVID, I guess. Info Exchange and Procure Pro as well. Everyone comes together. We have a rotating system for whose offices, who does beer, who does pizzas, and somehow it all tends to work out. This is us on social media / the internet. Follow us on Twitter for our 1 tweet a quarter. Bound to be good.
It's the 1 tweet you care about. Yeah. Next week.
Telling you about the meetup you're already going to. Tonight we've done something a little different. We're doing a few lightning talks. So as always, we've got Nathan doing the what's new on PHP, sort of the quarterly update of what's been happening. Dan's doing a talk on WebP Images using Blade, which should be pretty cool. And thanks, because that was a talk that was proposed via GitHub, Twitter actually, but still sort of proposed by the community, which is always good to see. And then we're doing lightning talks as well, something just a little bit different too. So just a few 10 or whatever minute talks. We're just going to talk really. James. Yeah. There you are. It's going to like face blind as soon as I start talking. James will be doing one on data. Sam will be doing one on the interpreter. And I'll be doing one on testing. So that's all I have. So with that in mind, we'll jump straight to it, and Nathan can tell us what's new in PHP land. Nate, what's new in PHP land?
Thanks. I'm glad you asked. So I wrote these a couple days ago. I was actually prepared this time. I wrote them before the day of the meetup, which is great. Guess what, guys? We have a new version of PHP. It came out the 25th of November, which is like 5 days ago. So that does mean that they're already working on PHP 8.2, but I'm not going to talk about that tonight because I learned my lesson last time about talking about the 8.1 stuff and running out of stuff to talk for the next meetup. So I was going to do a quick recap over what I think is the coolest things in 8.1. So it's very subjective, but objective in my mind. By far the coolest thing is enumeration. So I shouldn't point at this screen because you can't see where I'm pointing. So I have done this sort of code like so many times. I want to pass in, I want to have a list of values I can pass in to my function here. So then either I don't validate things and my code crashes in production, or I validate it and then I also have a typo, so that code's definitely. Didn't write this code in PHP still, apparently. Anyway, so you validate it, and then you have to write tests to ensure that it catches all the things, and it's just effort. So then before enumerations, once you implement something like SAM or PHP stand, which is static analysis, you can do stuff like this, where you specify, these are like your list of valid values, and you can use this like magic annotation here to say it has to be one of these values that starts with like suit underscore. And then you don't have to write any tests because SAM and PHP stand pick up on all of your issues and complain if you pass in like a wrong thing. So that saves you a lot of code without having to write tests, but it's still like kind of annoying because it's not really like a runtime check. Then enums are this like magic thing, and you can see the code display here doesn't even know the word enum yet. So an enum is kind of like in other languages that you've seen enums in, where you specify your list of values, and now down here, it's an actual type. You can think of an enum kind of like a class. It works pretty much exactly the same as a class with a couple of limitations, but it also has this extra ability of like, you have these like valid values you pass in like this, just like a constant sort of. And if you pass in like the string hearts, it'll complain because you have to pass it in like this way. But you can also assign that to like a value and that sort of thing as well. So that's kind of cool, but it gets cooler because you can do what's called backed enum. So you can back your enum by either a string or an int, and that's like you can give it a value. So then this lets you store it in like a database. So you can have this stored in a database, and then you can say like new enum and pass in a H, and it will just give you back this like instance of suit parts. So that's pretty cool as well, because it lets you do things that are just like persistent over time through database, through Redis, that sort of thing. But it gets cooler. This is why it's my favorite. You can add functions to an enum. This is ridiculous. You just have the functions, then you can like get the color of your card based on like what it is. So you can just pass this around, and it's exactly like a normal class, just with like extra bonus powers. And I think it gets even better. No, it doesn't. That's as good as it gets. But it's pretty cool.
What's the usage of that though? What's the usage look like?
So that's all it's used for.
Yeah, if you're not making a deck of cards, then there's no point.
How do you call the color function if you can't instead share it?
I think I had an example of that.
Checkmate.
Where I had an example of that.
Is that where you've got suit there? Like you'll have $suit and you can.
Yeah, so you can assign it to a value, right? So like this is pick a card returns heart. So this card value here now is like an instance of this enum. So then you can use this like special thing, which is like value, and that gives you back what the back thing is. And you can also call methods on it. It's magic.
Did you say so then?
I could be wrong. I wrote this late on that.
It's happened before.
Always tells me. Jesus, guys. You guys haven't been in person very often recently, have you? So the next coolest thing is you get read-only properties now. So something that I've also done quite often is something that looks like this. So I have a private property that I want to instantiate in the constructor, and like I don't want it to be able to be changed. So this is like the way that you get immutability in PHP previously. But now you can, previously in PHP 8, they introduced this constructor property promotion, which saves you a little bit. You don't have to write this like this little instantiation line. You don't have to write the declaration line as well. So you have that is your little class now. And then you can go one step further with PHP 8.1, and you can have this read-only keyword, which doesn't have to exist here. It can also exist back here. But read-only means that your variable can only be set one time, and it has to be set in the constructor. And if you try and set it at any other point, you get a runtime error. Which now we have like proper immutability in PHP. How good. I mean, I'm sure there's magic ways of getting around it because it's PHP, but what can you do? Next coolest thing is they're making callables like a callback, like a first class thing. Instead of having to pass around, you pass around like an array of like object and then string, which happens to be a method name on that object, which is just, and then you can call it by putting brackets after it. It's just an array. It just breaks my mind every time. But now you can do this, these little 3 dots. This is not like a typo. This is like actual PHP code. You put that inside your function. Now it's a callable. You can store that in a variable, and you can call this, and you can pass in the parameters to. Yeah, I don't love the syntax, but like I'm excited that this is going to be a thing. Next step is then to do like some proper functional programming stuff. I think it's called like currying, where you can instantiate your callback and pass in the first couple of parameters, and then you can pass in the next ones later. That's mad. I've always wanted to do that, but what can you do?
TypeScript.
Can you do it in TypeScript?
Do everything in TypeScript. Lord said approaching TypeScript.
We also are getting intersection types. So previously, if you wanted to like pass in something that was like two different things, those two things had to be like interfaces, and you had to define an interface that extends both those things so that you can pass in a countable iterator in case you ever want to have something that's both a countable and an iterator. But now you can do this with this little ampersand sign to mean that whatever you pass in here has to implement both those interfaces. I don't think it makes sense if it's anything that's not an interface that you're passing in there. In fact, I think when I read the RFC, I think you can only use it with interfaces, because it just makes no sense to be like two different objects, right? Unless one of them extends the other, at which point you don't even need to do that. You can just put the parent class and that's fine. And then, this array unpacking thing that came out in, let's say 7.4, I think, that lets you unpack your array. That used to only work with arrays that were lists, that were like when all of your indexes in the array were like starting at 0 and incrementing by 1. At any point that it doesn't increment by 1, then it becomes like a not list array. But now, this used to be like a runtime error, essentially, if you had string keys that you try and unpack. And that was by design when they first released this, because no one could decide how it should work. Like if you have two arrays that both have A in it and you unpack them both into another array, which one wins? Because if you've ever used the array union operator, which is the plus, or the array merge function, they both do the exact opposite of each other in that exact scenario, which is fun. So I think array merge won out in this eventually.
So the last one wins that.
The last one wins, yeah. That's the way that you expect it to work, unless you do the plus operator, and then there's the first one. Naturally, yeah. You can also you know how you've got like default parameters in a function? You used to not be able to like call like an initializer in there, like instantiate another object, but now you can, which is pretty cool. I don't know if I've ever needed to really do that, but it's there if I need it. But the cool thing about this is it gives extra special bonus feature of being able to do, where's my other example? Oh no. Oh no, it's there. That's good. You can now do, what's it called? Nested attributes or annotations, right? So previously, when they released this new attribute syntax, you couldn't nest them. So you still had to do the old annotation syntax if you wanted to have like nested annotations, like this Symfony example here. But now, because you can like do the initializer stuff inside the constructor injection, this just comes out of the box. And this was like a big sticking point for annotations when they were first released, because I don't know if everyone remembers, but when they released annotations, they had to do like 5 different RFCs that all got downvoted and rejected over like multiple years. And this was one of the sticking points. It was like, how do we handle this case? And the RFC that eventually got through, they just said, let's not handle that case. And then now we just get it for bonus features. That's cool. Fibers are coming in, which is a thing that you probably won't have to interact with directly yourself. It's aimed at framework developers so that they can do like async IO stuff and bake it in at a super low level. But the idea is if you use like a framework like React PHP, you probably write code like this, where you've got like promises and callbacks and that sort of thing, so that you can handle like the async nature of it. But now with fibers, if React PHP, when React PHP implements the fibers, you can just write your code like normal, and it just works, because when you call this like request get body, it just like on its own uses the fibers to like pause your thread and then like do the IO and then come back, and you just don't have to worry about it. And I think this is last but not least, there's some pretty big performance improvements coming in 8.1. So you can see 7.4 to 8, there wasn't much of a performance improvement, but then to 8.1, we got about an increase of 25% for something like the likes of Symfony. When you go down to WordPress, it's still a 3.5% improvement, which is not the same, but it's still a lot better than 0. And I don't think I thought I had a list of the things they did to improve that, but there's just it wasn't any one thing that improved that, it's just a bunch of little fixes in different places that improved the speed over time. The PHP Fig group, the people that make like the PSR standards and that sort of thing, got sick of like deprecating old standards and creating new standards for when like new syntax comes out, and now your old like PSR2 code style guide is like out of date because it doesn't handle the new syntax. So now they're creating a new thing, which is called a PER instead of a PSR. And that just means it evolves over time and they can update it instead of having to deprecate it and create a whole new one, which mainly is just around, it changes their voting process for how you can update something. Because like previously with the PSR, you can't update it once it's been approved and it's out. This is just not allowed to be changed. But a PER can be changed. Magento is a fun one. So apparently Adobe somehow owns Magento. I didn't know this, but recently they announced that they want to take Magento and they want to split it out into microservices, all that run on Adobe I/O, whatever that happens to be. So the community wasn't very happy about that because they were like, we like monoliths because monoliths are easy. And so they forked Magento and now they're just maintaining their own version of Magento, which is apparently going to be compatible with Adobe's version until they decide to rip it out into microservices. So that's interesting.
It's not an MySQL and MariaDB situation.
Exactly, yes. Composer 2.2 is coming out very soon. And normally I don't talk about minor version releases because there's way too many, but Composer 2.2 is meant to be 10 times faster than Composer 2 and use 90% less memory. Like that's absolutely ridiculous. And there were some fun stats that they posted on their blog about like, it drops the, like they calculated like if every Composer install in the world happens in like 20% of the time, which is only a fifth faster, then it saves like megatons of CO2 and saves like, it's like building another Amazon or some shit, just because of how many times Composer install gets run every day.
Yes.
Synfont process. Fun fact, not a typo. Someone published a package called Synfont process, which was actually malware, just relying on developers to mistype Symfony, and then it actually installed Synfont process, which is an exact copy almost of Symfony process. It does all the same things you expect it to do, except every time you call it, it pings their server and says, hey, here's all the stuff that's in your environment on your server. And then that malware dude can then ping your server with a special token in the get parameter and get a full web shell into your server and do like whatever they want. I probably shouldn't.
Self-censored.
Yeah, self-censored.
I want to make you.
That'd be great. So yeah, that was pretty hectic. And they some like internet sleuths think they tracked down the guy. They're not entirely sure, but they like followed back like a bunch of GitHub links and found this like random PHP developer in China. And he happens to also have another repo on his GitHub account that had similar code for like making a web shell, but it was just for fun sort of thing. And it was, so like it could have been here, but maybe someone just stole his code to put in here. No one really knows. And yeah, PHP 8.2 is being developed at the moment. There's a couple of features being accepted. There's a lot that's being discussed. So come back next year to learn more about that. Does anyone have any questions?
You're not going to mention new PHP Foundation?
Yeah.
Oh, that was going to be a thing. I totally thought about it and then didn't put it in. Yeah, so JetBrains and a bunch of other like big sort of PHP organization supporters like Symphony Foundation and all the frameworks. And who else is in it? It's a bunch of,
Automatic, so WordPress,
Yeah.
WordPress, yeah.
private packages, Kia, Zen, PrestaShop. Just
that's work good. Yeah, obviously, yeah. So they've all come together. They've all come together to make a PHP foundation whose goal is to essentially accept donations and also donate a lot themselves and fund PHP development. So their goal is to fully pay full market rate salaries for the main contributors to PHP and to attract more developers to PHP. So if you contribute to PHP, you can actually apply to them and say, hey, I want to get paid for 10 hours a week working on PHP code, and they'll pay you that if they can. That's their goal. And the thing that actually prompted this was Nikita Popovic, I think that's how you say his name. Close enough. Who's been a core contributor in PHP for very long time. Has decided to move on with his life and do something else. He's going into a different language or something like that. And he's the one that built the JIT, which is the most complex part of the code base. And it was only a few months ago, someone posted a blog post about the JIT is so complicated. There's only 2 people in the world that are even close to understanding it, and he's one of them. So then now if one of these guys happens to leave, it's going to be really bad. And then this guy decides to leave. So anyway, this is the solution to it, is to get all these massive companies donating a bunch of money. And anyone can start donating to the foundation as well to help fund PHP development. So hopefully that turns out really well. It's not the first time someone's tried to do this, but this is the furthest that's gotten before.
It's got the PHP Fellows group, which looks like a pretty decent group. Maximus and Joe Russins.
Yeah, all the guys that are core to PHP for a very long time, plus all of the large companies that kind of depend on it, which is good. So it should be good. Anyway, that is me done. No more questions? Should we just jump straight into the WebP talk?
I think so.
What time is it? Perfect. And then that should lead us straight into, oh, oops, my bad.
Mate, spoilers.
Spoilers. How do I make it big again?
Hit escape. Left.
There you go, that's fine, that's the front.
Hey, double click.
That's the
I say that like it's a thing we all know how to do.
There's full screen. Is that it? Ah, there we go. Oh, good. I don't use Mac.
All right, hello, I'm Dan Beeston. I'm the sole proprietor of CivicNet Web Development. I've been using Laravel since version 3. I've been using CSS since it was trying to become version 2. And I've been using HTML since this was the thing. I can almost hear or feel chills running through some people who recognize what this is. If you're new to HTML, maybe you don't understand, maybe you have questions. Maybe that question is, Dan, what the hell is this? Why are you using a transparent GIF to prop open a table cell? Well, back in the late 90s, there was no CSS grid, there was no flexbox, I don't think there was float left and float right. In order to put things on a page, you would get a table and you would stick the things in the cells that you want to do. And if that became more complicated, you would stick a table inside that table cell. It was not graceful. Now, one of the problems with table cells at the time is that min width wouldn't affect it. And so you would have to, if it was collapsing, you would need to get an image to push it open and basically prop it open. Number 2 problem is min width didn't exist at all. It was a really nice thing to have. The only problem is that when it did come in, it didn't support table cells. And indeed still doesn't in Outlook. What else we got? Now, you might be thinking GIF image, surely a ping image would be smaller. Usually a ping image is smaller than a GIF. An 8-bit ping image will be smaller than a GIF, but on a file that's really, really small with very little data, the headers in the ping are actually bigger than the GIF. So it's smaller to go with the GIF image. And finally, ping images weren't supported in 1998. Ping images got support in, I think, Internet Explorer 6, and we could finally use ping images in about 2006. At the time, updates didn't happen automatically in browsers, and so you'd have to rely on the user to upgrade their browser, and the little thing would say, would you like to upgrade your browser? And of course they would say, no, God, no, why? So ping images are generally a little bit smaller than GIF. They can be between 5% and 25% smaller, but you probably don't want to use it for a photograph. Pings and GIFs, 8-bit GIFs, are great for things like logos, flat color, simple gradients. If you're going to go to photographs, you want to go with something else. Now, pre-2006, you could use JavaScript to sort of swap out a GIF image and put in a ping image if it detected that it could run it. But the problem with JavaScript at the time, in these pre-jQuery days, is that it was so hard to use that someone had to invent jQuery. Now, there was something for photographs, and that's JPEG images. We're all familiar with JPEGs. They've been around for 25 years, and apparently there's nothing better because they've been around for 25 years and we always use them. Photographs. People have tried to make good replacements for JPEG. There was JPEG 2000, which compressed better, but used quite a lot of memory, and so wasn't the best solution there. It didn't have universal support. So this is JPEG 2000 support. If you're using Safari, great, go ahead. Everyone else, there's a problem. Now there are alternative formats. There's WebP, there's AVIF, there's JPEG XL. Now JPEG XL compresses down better than every single other one. So possibly we could use that one, but we may need to use a fallback. How about WebP? WebP is supported by almost all current browsers. Weirdly enough, Internet Explorer doesn't support it. They're usually so far ahead of the curve. And Safari will support it if you're using the Big Sur operating system or later. It is quite an interesting thing. This is a JPEG image that's been compressed down like crazy, down to 40%, and then a WebP compressed to 40% as well. You'll notice that this one's less than half the size, and it looks a little bit better. You'll notice the JPEG artifacting that we all recognize from our memes. And then the WebP, the way that it takes that information, basically just makes me look younger, which I quite like. Now, if you want to use a WebP image, it's super easy. This is just an image tag. You put the WebP in instead of a JPEG, and it just works in all but 2 browsers. You'll notice here I've set the width and the height. Back in the old days, we would do this, and then people were like, no, use style sheets to set your width and height. But just recently, people have started to realize that this is actually a really valuable thing because it loads with the rest of the HTML. If you rely on the style sheet to bring it in, or conceivably just wait for the image to load, because when the image loads in the headers is how wide and tall it is, then if those files don't load, then possibly you have a paragraph of text, you have your image, which has no height, so it's 0 height, then you have your next bit of text. Once that thing loads, then it pops open, which number 1, sucks for the user, and number 2, forces a redraw, and why not avoid redraws if we have to? All right, so if we want to support a high definition display, we can go to the source set attribute. So here we can set just a standard definition, 1 pixel equals 1 pixel, and we have our image that's 450 by 600 wide, and then underneath it, we set our 2 by 2, so retina displays, and we have our double size image so that it looks nice on a nice big display, but we're not loading great big image for someone who isn't going to use it. The great thing about this is it doesn't load any of the images except the one that it's decided is the right one to go with. And if the browser for some reason doesn't acknowledge the source set tag, it will go with just the source tag. And browsers have been able to do that since, I guess, HTML3. All right, now, what if I want to fall back? I want to use WebP, but if WebP doesn't work, I want to go back to Jpeg. What you can do is you can, instead of putting the source set attribute in the image tag, you set a source tag. This source tag has a type, and you put in the MIME type, which is here we've got image WebP, then we put in our source set information, then we get a second source tag, we put in a different MIME type, Jpeg. So the browser comes along, if it can't recognize WebP, then it moves to the next one. If it can't recognize any of them, it just goes to the image tag. We do have an alt tag there. Everyone uses alt tags. No one leaves them out. Now, actually, rather importantly, you'll notice that obviously because the image tag is not a source tag and the source tag is not a source tag, these all have to be collected together. They're collected together in a picture tag. One gotcha for picture tags is, as I understand it, image tags are inline by default still, and so are picture tags. But a lot of resets that you have and normalized programs can change that image to a block. But if your picture tag is not a block, you might be sitting there going, why is there a margin underneath my image? You just need to set the block tag on the picture, which you can do a tailwind by putting in class block or use a style sheet targeted display block. We all know how to do this. All right, so let's say that I've loaded in my banner image on my website. It can be quite a big image if it's going to be double resolution. I may want to put a background image on that image, something that loads quickly, just in case I'm on really slow dial-up. So what I can do is, let's say I get that image, I resize it down to 4 pixels by 4 pixels, little tiny image, and then just stretch it out and set it as the background image of the image tag. And I get something that looks like this, which doesn't show you what the image is going to be, but I think grabs the sort of the heart and soul of what San Francisco looks like. So this can pop in wherever you need it, but loading a 4x4 image takes a surprisingly long amount of time. There's not much data in it, but when you're pulling down any file, there's a round trip stuff that's going on. It goes out, so there's handshake back and forth a couple of times. This can be weirdly slow for something so small. So why not just inline it? So you can get your image, the little tiny PNG image, you can translate it to base64 and then just jam it straight into the background image, into the URL tag on the style. And then you just stretch it 100 by 100 and you end up with that previous image. So we've gotten to the point where we're loading in our image, but what about when it comes to mobile? We may want to load a slightly different image for mobile because little tiny vertical screen, maybe you don't want a little tiny banner up the top, maybe you want something that's more a portrait. So you would want a square image for mobile, a great big banner. Now, there are a couple of ways to do this. You can use JavaScript, you can use media queries in your style sheet. Why not just put the media queries straight into the source tag? You'll notice at the top here, our first source tag has a media query on it. It checks to see whether the image is 450 pixels wide or less, and it checks to see whether it's vertical. If so, it's probably a mobile phone. Let's give it the square image. If it can't load WebP, then load in Jpeg. You'll notice there is no media tag on the Jpeg one. There should be. That's my fault. I screwed up. And then underneath again, the desktop WebP, the desktop JPEG, the background image, the width, the height, the alt tag. And let's say we also want to support 8K monitors. So we wanted even more depth in our image. We would be able to add to the source set of our desktop. So we could throw up a 3x image down here. At this point, we have 2 WebP images for mobile, 2 JPEG images for mobile, 3 WebP images for desktop, 3 JPEG images for desktop, 1 4x4 image that is base 64 encoded and jammed in. This is an enormous amount of work. Now, say that this is for a banner on a website. Say it's for an 8-page website with a banner on each page. That's 88 images that you have to deal with. And the client looks at it and they say, oh my God, this looks amazing. This is great. Could those banners be 20 pixels shorter, please? People recognize this scenario.
That's the wrong blue.
So there has got to be a better way to do this. I wrote a package. I'm very excited about this package that I wrote.
I was just thinking, wouldn't it be good if there was a package that
Wouldn't it be great? Now, obviously, you could use build process to do this sort of stuff. You could set up the stuff locally, or you could go through and do it manually. You could do that if you wanted to. Let's say instead of our image tag, we install this package, and straight away we just use an x.image tag. We upload our images on in our storage. It's the biggest one we have. We don't need to crop it. We just throw it up there where it needs to go. As long as it looks nice there, we're going to make it look nice. And we set the width. So what the program does is it grabs the image, it scales it down to 800 wide, it saves that copy, it then spits out a 1x1 version and a 2x2 version for high def displays. It then automatically resizes to 4x4, caches that, spits it into the background image URL, resizes it, works out the size of that image and automatically puts it in with the width and the height tag. That is quite useful, but it's not cropping anything. This is blade image crop. So instead of putting the width in, you could set a properties tag on the blade component. And in this case, it will just trim 10 pixels off the top and bottom of that file before it saves it into the file structure. And then it just does the exact same thing. This is really great for something like a real estate company where you've got a whole bunch of photos from a whole bunch of different cameras, and they're just online, and you can just type this in, pull those files in, and it'll just chop, 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 chop. The first time that page is loaded using Blade, it'll do all this sort of stuff, and every time after that, it'll just pull those files straight out. But in this case, we are just loading a JPEG image, and we want to load a WebP image because those things are nice and they make us look younger. So we can use an xpic tag rather than an ximage tag. We do exactly the same thing. We set the properties, all the width, we put it inside a picture tag, and then it spits out 2 source tags and an image tag without a source set on it, and does all the chop, 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 and you end up with supporting WebP, and then JPEG fallback, and then image if it doesn't work. So that's pretty neat. I'm quite pleased about that, but the 1x1 and the 2x2 isn't the only way that you can switch out images using the picture tag. There is also a slightly different system where you can you can give the browser the width that you want the screen to change images. And here you can see that we put in a 300 by 100 image, which is probably about that big. And then on a browser, we don't want it to change height, but we want it to go width. So various media points, different widths. We can set that in, and then rather than 1 by one and over. Oh, you guys can see this? Yes, you can. Then this recognizes what width your screen is at and jumps to the correct image that you want. There's even more that you can delve into. There's a sizes attribute where you can set media queries on different width images. It's super complex, but if this doesn't, if you want more, there's more to find, and all you need to do is throw the sizes attribute in with your class tags and your alt tags, and the package will pull in all those attributes the way that Blade does. All right, now, if you want to do the trick with the mobile, so a square image for mobile and a banner image for desktop, then you can sort of break these things apart a bit. There's an X sources tag that'll spit out all the different sources that you need with the media queries that you attach to it. So here we can see we've got our properties set on the to square for this one, and then the desktop one underneath. We've also set sources to false because we don't want a source set to be loaded into that image tag. We want it to read that out of the source tags. It shouldn't matter, but it's not going to get read anyway, so why put it in there? Only one problem with taking a banner image and making a mobile image out of it is that sometimes you cut off something important. Most photos do not have the really cool thing dead center. That is very bad photographic advice. There's something called rule of thirds. My wife can do a talk next time about it. So what we want to do is we want to be able to target which part of that original image has the square, is the focus point. So in properties, we can set width and height as 300, and then 65% across, 50% down is the center of our image. That's the focus point of our image. And so it'll just chop a square out of that. That's our mobile image, and our bison doesn't get bifurcated. What have we got next? Oh, yes. Almost the end. Cool. This is the config. You can change a bunch of these different things, like publish config. If you want to support AVIF, AVIF is currently only supported by Chrome, but it is coming to Firefox, I believe. And it is slightly smaller again than WebP and slightly nicer again. WebP has that sort of kind of at big high compression rates. It's got that kind of ghostly anti-wrinkle filter going on, whereas AVIF is based on some of the really cool video codec work that's been going on, and it's a little bit better at finding edges and making things sort of clear and refined. So that's quite a nice one. What you could do is you could write your own build class, throw it into the config file here, set the extension name as AVIF and put it ahead of WebP and Jpeg, and then it'll just, and that class, all it needs to do is take a GD object and then save it as an AVIF. At the moment, GD library doesn't do that. You've got to install stuff on the server, and if you are happy to install that sort of stuff on the server, you know how to write your own class. Now, JPEGs are a bit of a weirdo thing. They can be a lot bigger than they need to be. They are, if you save one in Photoshop, it can be very different to saving in GD library or ImageMagick. And indeed, there are places on the website, Kraken.io and ShortPixel, and their business model is to save your JPEG as small as it will possibly go. And they can be quite good. And indeed, I've written a little one here. So if you've got a ShortPixel account, you can just trade one in and trade one out, and they'll save it as ShortPixel. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller. It might be better, it might be higher quality. But ultimately, your WebP is going to be better and it's going to be smaller in pretty much every scenario. And you can even change the background if you don't want it to be a 4x4 image, if you want it to be 3x3 or 5x5, or you want it to be an SVG image made up of a whole bunch of triangles and then blurred. As long as that can be converted into base64 and jammed into that URL, you are laughing. So that's Blade image crop. I'm very pleased with this. I've put a lot of work into the documentation, which is apparently the most important thing. The only thing that I don't like about this is this number here, that one there, because the first 6 of those were from version 1, and version 1 sucked. So I would love it if people wanted to have a crack at this, have a play around with it, and hopefully find any issues that they had with it. Other than that, I am good to go. Are there any questions about this realm at all?
How long did it take you from deciding you wanted to build the package to actually having it handle all those different edge cases?
Well, version 1 probably took probably a couple of days, and most of that was just the maths of targeting the image, because the maths of figuring out where a point is in an image and where the closest edge is, and whether it's nearest this edge or this edge, is very complicated. And if you put like 90 by 90, you're going to get like a little chunk of the corner. So all of that messing around with that was taken care of in version 1. And then thanks to COVID, I had some time to myself. And so I decided to do a version 2, which allowed me to, and that took probably 2 or 3 weeks to working on that every day to find all those edge cases and stop it from screwing up, which seems to be 90% of everyone's work. Anyone else?
So you're saying it doesn't work in IE?
This works in IE, yes. This means that it just won't load a WebP.
Why is technically dead?
Yeah, exactly. As far as I'm
Yeah. So as far as I'm concerned, it's dead.
It's dead, yeah.
Yes.
Around to my clients, tell them that.
sure.
That would be nice, wouldn't it? All right. So yes, feel free to install this. If, as an addendum, if any of you like the film Die Hard, there is a play going on at the Brisbane Powerhouse in about 2 weeks called Die Hard, the movie, the play. It is. I wish I got this sort of engagement in my speech. It is, but at least I wrote that too. So this is a really fun show. It sold out last time it was on a couple of years ago, and it's well on its way to selling out. So if you like Die Hard, get along to the live version at the Powerhouse. It starts it's the 2 weeks leading up to Christmas.
Did you say you wrote it?
Yes, some friends and I wrote it.
Awesome.
So
It's a great Christmas movie.
It is.
cool. All right, thank you very much.
Please leave it here. Yeah, I think we'll take our break.
Okay. Sorry, internet.
Yes, I think so. We'll take a half-hour break, and then we're back on. The stream will keep going, so just keep an eye on it.
Feel free to eavesdrop on conversations while we're not here and see what happens. It's just swear. Feels so nice.
That's brand new.
Yeah.
That's the. It looks like a Mac Pro from the old days.
I know. It's back to like my first
Yeah,
MacBook.
I wish I had one of these, but that's all right.
Just wait till my day.
Yeah, exactly.
Over the last couple of years. It's pretty expensive.
Who was going first? First lightning talk.
James, do you want to go first?
Yeah. Which one's yours, James? Which one's interesting data techniques?
And then Sam's, I sent through Slack as well.
Okay.
As we got that down. Is the stream still going?
Yep, stream's going.
I don't know if the 7 people still watch.
All right, so PHP at the limits is ready for Sam. All right.
Go for it. I don't know what's happening on the slides there, but that's all right. Yeah, I don't know how to fix that, so I'm just gonna leave it. What do you want me to do? Oh, thanks. Okay, so this is a very quick lightning talk. Really, as you can tell, I struggled to name the talk, but it's quite broad. 3 interesting data techniques that I've used to solve problems. So yeah, let's get into it. So the year was 2014. I was working on my very first public API. REST was, I just discovered what RESTful services and all that sort of stuff was. And I discovered a talk that sort of changed the way I looked at things. So REST, as you know, is quite like we're pushing a different state in, we're pushing a new copy of something in, we're updating certain attributes and things like that. And then I discovered a talk called Turning the Database Inside Out. And it changed the way that I looked at the world ever since. So the bit that I remember from the talk, because I haven't watched it since, so it's clearly had a profound impact on me, is the way that database servers work traditionally is actually through a log file. So a request comes in to update something, try and point to it, update something. The server then writes that to a log file, and the log file is distributed to any other servers that are also staying in sync. And so they say, okay, I'll update this number to 5, and then the other server will receive that through the log file, and they say, oh, I'll also update my number for this thing to 5. And that's how they stay in sync. But the idea of pushing something onto one thing and then the state being derived from the series of changes is something that's really stuck with me. So this is kind of a really basic version of CQRS where the read and the writes are kind of 2 separate operations. I won't go into CQRS because probably don't know it that well to try and do a talk on it. But that's kind of a foundational concept sort of thing. We use this sort of stuff in services and things like that. So we'll see a series of changes, but then when we query, we just get the latest copy of that particular thing, eventual consistency and all sorts of stuff. So we use this heaps in our payroll system. So we'll extend on it a little bit. Let's say we're trying to look at leave balances. We could potentially just have the leave balance stored as the latest state. So Tom has 50 hours of annual leave, and then a pay slip's paid, and then they've got 52 or whatever. But we could also, like what that limits us to do is to say what changes came together to see this. Your bank account is not just $50 like mine. It would be like a series of changes that come together to make up that final balance sort of thing. So we can apply that here. So we can see the leave balance changes. But what's interesting and what's limited about this style of approach here is we've got the same employee, different pay slips. And on number 9, some sort of edit has occurred and the leave balance has changed from 14 to 15. So it's jumped from 12 to 15. Is that right? Is that wrong? I don't know. Hopefully it's right in our system. It will be. But that's not the way that accountants seem to see the world, which is fair enough. They're a bit like software devs, they're a bit strange as well. So instead, we could actually look at the debits and credits, and we can roll back what happened in the previous version, and then we can roll forward what's about to happen. So the leave balance, we can apply the same concept. We could say we are debiting 0 for the first, obviously it's just payslip gen. Second, payslip gen, fine, credit, credit, credit. And then the third one, we see that we've done a payslip gen, it's added 2, and then we've done some sort of edit, we've rolled back to 2, and then we've rolled forward to 3. So we can see more information from this stuff. You can think of it like ships moving around or some sort of physical object. If you were to track the current state in time, you only get a limited picture. But if you were to track that state over time, we could work out distance, we could work out speed, we can work out all these other interesting attributes. We can derive extra information. So let's take, there's heaps of, that's true. There is heaps of variations in this concept. Very wise point. Like you're looking at Redux, Redux, right? Yeah, whoever wrote that, my God. Doesn't have much design skill, but good content. Redux, all of the reactive front end stuff, like being able to replace state, like it all comes back to this concept sort of thing. Then we use it also for race conditions. So this is where things start to get pretty interesting. So one point in time that I will admit, when we have shift approvals, there's a background process that needs to fire off to basically process that into a pacer, right? And that takes some time. That's not a simple process. A lot involved there. So what we were doing is we would have a state-based thing that says, okay, this shift has been approved. We would mark the flag to needs to get processed, please. And then the background job would come along and it would process it and then mark it as done. The issue with that, though, is that you've created a race condition. So you can see here by my wonderful timeline and my sweet design skills, we start processing the job. We fetch out the shift details from the database, but in the background, a web request has come flying through and it's changed it. It's gone from 9 a.m. till 10:30 or something. And all of a sudden, what we're dealing with and what we're processing is stale data. So we can apply this logging logic and the way that we deal with that to solve this problem. So obviously, sorry, I'll just finish this slide here because I'm about to move on. But we would then process the stale data. Say we started with 9 a.m. It got changed to 10:30. And then when we mark the flag back to done, we've actually missed the 10:30. Like that'll never go into the pacer. It'll just get lost because the job got marked as finished. Like there's nothing to do here. And then it moves on sort of thing. So we can solve this. So the way that we would approach this is essentially we apply the log technique that we've been discussing before. And then we would have a flag on each record. So we could process them sequentially. So we could say for each version or each edit of an approved shift, we would process each one individually and then we'd miss nothing. But that's also inefficient because then potentially Tom's really fiddly with the approved shifts function and he's making heaps of changes and it could be 7 or 8 versions when it could have just been 2 or something like that, let's say, right? So instead, we apply this logic and we go and grab all of the log versions for a given shift. We can then go and grab the latest details for the one that we've grabbed. If any changes come in while we're processing this, we add that to the log with the process flag of false. And then when we finished our work, we take our ID, which would be 3 for the log, and we would say, update everything from 3 backwards, anything older than that for this shift is finished. Mark that as done. The next time the job comes through, there's actually 4 and 5 that haven't been processed now. This is new information that came in while we were doing the request. We can then query that and go, oh, this new work that's come in, I'll go and process that now. And then you can do it. And then you mark from 5 and 4 done in the same versions. So this is a concept that we use to avoid race conditions. It's pretty interesting. It took me a little bit to figure out. For you smart people, you probably figured it out before I even finished the talk. But yeah, that's just something that we use. We use it at a whole bunch of places because we do a lot of background processing. There's a lot of heavy work that needs to be done in our systems. So yeah, that's the talk. Any questions? That was lightning. Moved up to the name. Yeah. No, sweet. Cool.
Yeah, sounds fun.
Yeah. I didn't have anything to work down with that.
All right. So this started a few weeks ago, talking PHP Australia Slack, and the discussion came up of the limits of PHP. So I stupidly decided, I'm an idiot, I'm going to see if I can find them. So what type of limits are we talking about? You know, how big files can be, that type of stuff. So I figured, let's figure out what's the longest string you can have in PHP. What's the maximum file size you can process in PHP with the interpreter? And how many operations can you have in PHP before the interpreter cracks out? The reason why these are kind of important is because, you know, the interpreter is still just a program, it still has limits, it still has to run on the same machine as everything else. So string length, I brute forced it. I just made a small program which would keep spitting out files which just extended the A's into the string and just keep extending them and keep extending them until, and then running that program, that PHP file in shell exec until it crashed. Yep, so just run this. It's very, very complex method and got some results. PHP 7.2 crashed when it ran out of memory. What a surprise. So it didn't crash the interpreter, but it crashed the application at runtime. PHP 7.3 got a little bit interesting. It crashed when it got to half the number of characters as there was available memory, which means in PHP 7.3, for each character stored in a string, it is taking up 2 bytes of memory, which is odd. Then PHP 7.4, 8, and 8.1 crashed when it was 3 bytes of memory to one character in a string, which is real bloody odd. So this is an odd regression that I wasn't expecting. I don't know if it's known about or intended, and it could actually affect the real world if you are running large conscripts which happen to process a lot of text data, and you have just bumped up from 7.2 to 7.3 because that's completely safe, and then everything starts crashing and you can't figure out why. So yeah, the failure mode of this one is PHP memory limit. The interpreter does not give a crap what you're doing there. And the other interesting thing was, if I don't put it inside a variable, so if I just put it in as a bare string, that extra byte of data that's stored for each character disappears. So it goes back to 2 bytes per character of the string if you don't put it in a variable for 7.4 plus. Real fucking weird. So file size, I thought, all right, had a decent approach for the last one, but I know it'll run out of memory if I use a string. So I just thought, screw it, let's put spaces in, see how far we can get before the interpreter craps out trying to load the file. Turns out 7.2, it doesn't. 7.3, it doesn't. 4, 5, 8, oh, sorry, 8.1. I let it run until it got to 1 gig files, PHP files, which were just spaces and an echo statement at the end. PHP interpreter did not give a crap. Thinking it might have just been stripping white space, I changed it to printing a block comment that was a gigabyte long and still didn't give a crap. So I'm guessing that means the interpreter is reading the file in as a stream and discarding anything until it finds something useful, until it finds a useful token, which is good to know. So yeah. And then the last one, operations. This one, what's the simplest operation? Negation. So same approach, lots and lots and lots of exclamation points in front of a true. Now, this one, if you'll notice, the step has dropped significantly because it crashed on the absolute very first thing that I did. Parser error. Memory exhausted. It doesn't even get to runtime. You can't control this memory. Nothing you do. It has absolutely nothing to do with the PHP memory limit that you set. Failed at 9,905 operations on every single version of PHP that I tried at, which means it could run 9,904 negations before it crashes. So that one kind of surprised me, and it might just be that it's building a really weird, complex parse tree, but it might also just be that's how many operations you can have in a single PHP file to go through the parser. So yeah, that's pretty quick. I did one other one which I didn't include in the slides because I did it this morning and then forgot to, where I just thought, how many tokens can I get? And I just did $A::$ and just repeated that. And it's roughly about 100,000 before it crashes with a memory error. What I found interesting with that is I'm not assigning anything to the variable. I'm reusing the same variable name over every single time, and it's still using up memory just to replace that variable with nothing. And it uses up memory, yeah, about 100,000 loops. But any questions on my stupidity?
How long do those scripts take to run?
Depending on the step, but not too long. About a minute or so. And yeah, I had it set up so I could test different versions of PHP because I'm a Linux pleb and have down to 5.6 still installed on my machine. But yeah, I just tested the active ones. The one where I was testing the file size, that would run indefinitely because it doesn't crash ever until I run out of hard drive space. And I have, I left that running for probably the best part of an hour. I probably ruined my SSD. Anything else?
I think it's one of those things like, I didn't need to know that, but like, I'm glad I do know that now, but I don't have any practical use for that information. But thank you.
The only one that I found particularly interesting is the spring one. And when I mentioned that in a group that has some internals people, they were also, has anyone noticed this? Because this sounds like a major bug.
Yeah, because it's also just bizarre.
Yeah.
It's a thing that just like drives you nuts then.
I found it particularly bizarre that not assigning it to a variable drops the burden off the memory use.
Sorry.
So can we use a follow-up on how you get this stuff fixed in the process?
I was considering just, submitting some general documentation changes, getting voting rights, and then just chicaning everything. That would be much worse, right?
All right, so last one for the night. Nathan proposed this talk topic for me because I didn't have a name. It's purely editorialized straight off BuzzFeed, but it worked because you're all here. So fair warning, this talk contains opinions and they tend to be generally extreme in nature. I love testing, so should you. It's good for you, like vegetables. You should do testing. Who tests? Who writes tests? Liam. As far as I'm concerned, like when you're shipping a new feature or changes, whatever, like tests are part of that. That's the thing you ship. Well, theoretically, hopefully you don't ship them as well, but that's kind of like part of the work that you do. They're not kind of like two things, they're kind of all one the same. Our job is testing, not a tester's role. That's a controversial opinion. But people get so obsessed with 100% code coverage. Every line of tests, every line of code needs to be covered with tests, which in the absence of other information, like is a good place to start, particularly if you have nothing, going from nothing to something, getting towards that goal, measuring what that percentage is a good way to talk about what level we're at. But 100% can be a bit of an odd one. You can cover every line and make 0 assertions, which is a really bad test, but technically you're 100% there. If you are doing that, your test might suck. So there's this great quote that if you change the logic and none of your tests fail, were you even really testing it? That came from the Groundhog Day movie, I think. And that's kind of the philosophy behind mutation testing, which is what I'm really talking about tonight. Who has heard of mutation testing? Who actively uses mutation testing? You guys can't answer. Okay, great. So this is new information. So the philosophy behind mutation testing is that I change your code ever so slightly. If your tests were good, they should have failed because we've changed the implementation. So some definitions that we're going to run through right now are mutant is a single change to your code. So we're going to try and change the smallest thing we can and run essentially your tests. Uncovered mutants is like a line of code that you changed, but your test actually didn't cover that line. So you might not have been 100% code coverage then yet. The bad one is an escaped mutant. So these are, your test covered that line, but when we made that change, the test didn't fail. That thing still passed. They call that escaped mutants or mutants that were not killed, which is fun. So in practice, there's this library called infection, kind of sits on top of PHP unit for you. And what it does is it runs your PHP unit suite with Xdebug code coverage on. So as it's going through each test, it's then saying, this test covered these, maybe 5 lines of your code, this covered this, and then it mutates your code and then says, well, I'm going to change this 1 line of code. What tests do I need to run over that? So you're not running all of them every time. So then for each mutation, it runs just the tests that cover that line. And it's probably not too legible up there, but you get an output that's like this. So this is like a little test project. I think there maybe like 7. I don't think there was 7. Maybe there was 7 tests. And it generated 18 mutations as a result. 16 of them were killed. So that means the test ran and they failed, which is bizarre, but it's a good thing because we changed the code, the test should fail. 2 of them though, we ran the test and the test passed. So you're probably missing some assertions or your assertions aren't good there. There's also like errors, like a PHP fatal error, syntax errors, those sort of things. They happen, but less common. And then what you get down the bottom, I'm not that tall. What you get down the bottom is, so you got like mutation code coverage, so what percentage of your code was tested in the first place. But the more interesting one is mutation stored indicator. So this is what percentage of the mutants were killed versus not. So the main question is like, how does that actually mutate your code? So infection has a bunch of mutators and keeps adding more and more. There's seriously heaps of them. It goes and does just fairly basic things that look really, really small. So taking basic math and just doing the opposite of it. Plus becomes minus, multiply becomes divide. Things like magic numbers. So 0s and 1s, they get flipped. Just sees a number in there. It's like, okay, we'll add 1 to it, see what happens. Greater than and equals, they all change, so change direction. But also, this is a really easy one to miss out on is you've got code that's greater than, and you write a test that covers the less than and the greater than case, so like what happens then. We didn't write a test case that covers the equals case, and that's like a really ambiguous thing then. So if you're coming back 6 months later looking at code, no one actually really documented what's supposed to happen in the equals case because there's no test to cover it. So it's like, is the current outcome of the product or of the code the desired outcome? Pretty ambiguous. So when it runs then and you have those escaped mutants, you can see a log like this, and you can see kind of get diff what it changed. So in here we changed to less than, it changed to less than or equal, test ran, they failed. So if you want to then go and like fix this essentially, you can go and make the same change to your code, just run your tests over it, and then your tests, you'll see for this one, they'll all pass. And you're like, well, that one should have failed, and you can step into your debugger and work out why it didn't, or write a new test case that bizarrely should fail with that change. Then you undo that change and you should pass. Again, weird. And this is another one that I've covered before, but control flow stuff. So in a for loop, like a continue and a break are basically identical if you only have one item in the array. So again, that's another one. If you're not covering the test case of multiple items in that array, you've potentially like someone's coming through, unfamiliar with the code base, trying to fix a bug, trying to do the right thing. And they're like, oh yeah, this fixes it, but there was no test to cover that. Now, it actually describes a lot of what infection, what I think it does a good job of covering is those ones where like, oh, it's just a quick little fix there for a little bug in production. But you go and change something that's potentially like quite catastrophic. So there are some considerations you need to think about though. So Xdebug is slow-ish in comparison, but it does only run for the initial pass through. So when it runs all your tests to work out what lines of code were executed. On the mutations, running just the subset of those tests, it doesn't run Xdebug for that, which is good. There's also the last item there is there's like a flag now that you can do like git diff stuff. So it only runs like a subset of the mutations that are in your git diff and stuff, which is really nice. Again, it speeds it up because it blows very quickly. You can imagine like you have a few lines of code and then there's like maybe 5 lines of code makes 18 mutants. And then you can imagine thousands of lines of code that starts to blow up pretty quick. Which probably leads into the best one, which is try to limit the scope of what you actually test with infection.
Don't add TCI.
Add TCI.
Run the whole lot against it.
Yes. I told you there's opinions.
Is that like 3?
Yeah, one of the last ones. I don't know. Nathan does.
It's what we have to do because we don't have compile to wait for it.
Yeah, exactly. So what I would recommend is tweak a config so that you run infection over a smaller subset of your code, not all of it, and aim for 100% MSI on that subset that you run. So what we have is like a few namespaces or essentially just directories, things like security, so permission checks, that sort of stuff, they get thoroughly tested through this. 100% MSI is the only option. And then we have like in our different namespaces, we have a sub namespace called core. So if we write any business logic, maths heavy, just code that you look at when you're reviewing, like, that's weird, man. I don't know how that works. You move that into core. Infection then will just rip you a new one and mean you have to write really good tests for it. You don't want to use it on, we have tried it on like just your regular controllers, just generic services and stuff. It generates things like changing publics to privates, protectors to privates, those sort of things that get really annoying really quickly. Stuff that's just kind of not really that necessary, I think, to test with infection. But what it really shines on is like, you've got some really hairy maths, really hairy stuff that is like kind of core to what your product does. It'll make sure you test it really, really well.
Trying to calculate like when the next business day is, time zones at 10 in the morning. That was tough.
Yeah. So it's one of those things as well that, again, coming back to our previous discussion, that test-driven development, it is a tool that then starts to inform the way you write code as a result, because you just struggle getting CI to pass with infection on that code. You then start to learn essentially how to circumvent the system, which as a result makes you write fundamentally more bulletproof code. But you start writing that from the start, to the point that like, I was actually going to show a demo of this, but I was genuinely actually struggling to, sounds really up myself, but it was actually difficult to try and write code that was going to fail, knowing that it was going to fail. It's all right, you're the best. Anyway, smoke is up my arse now, so we'll finish on that. But does anyone have any questions on that? Because it's a bit weird.
Yeah, so many.
Yeah, go.
How many lines of code did you cover?
It's difficult because we do like the diff stuff with infection now. Because I was looking at it before and like, I think it took like a minute to run all the unit tests and then it took 3 minutes to run infection. And then I realized I was just on some random branch. So just doing some random git diff that wasn't really helpful. I think it takes 10 minutes on CI to run though. It's one of our slowest ones at the moment.
Right. And what kind of stuff have you caught specifically with this test suite?
A lot of maths, that stuff of control flow stuff, continues and breaks, stuff where you're like, oh shit, I actually got that the wrong way around. I thought I was being smart. I wrote 10 tests for it, should be fine. But this is kind of forcing you to cover like every slight change you may ever make accidentally thinking you fixed a bug.
Yeah.
So as a result, then if someone tries to tell you your code is wrong, then your test's probably wrong as a result, which means you've written out, like you've in quite detail explained the assertion of like this case should have happened. And that is the thing that when you come to a code review, you have assertions that are very verbose. Like there's a lot of test cases for a small amount of code, but you've covered every edge case. And if you're talking about permission checks, payroll sort of stuff, like you'd prefer verbosity there rather than like a really like nifty 3-liner that sort of summarizes all the tests into one little neat thing.
Yeah.
So
One that got me one time was we had a permission check for a user that could do something, upload a file or attach it to something or other like that. And so we already had that permission check and it was tested with infection and that. And then months later, after I already heard all about it, we wanted another user to be able to do this thing. I'm like, oh, so I went in, I had a permission check and I changed the false to a true and it did what I wanted to do, and I wrote a test that said, oh, my new case works, this user can enter this thing. I'm like, that's awesome. Push it up, and like 5 tests failed, and those tests were the tests that infection made me write to prove that like all my other permission checks that came off that permission check were right. Because it turns out by like making this new user be able to do this, I'd also allow them to do these other things that I didn't want to do.
And
But I
those,
didn't think about that because these other parts that we're using this permission check I didn't find when I did the code.
Yeah.
So that only caught it because of those extra tests I wrote because of infection.
Yeah.
But if I didn't have those tests, I would have like let that out to production and then all these random users could do a bunch of shit I didn't want to do.
Yeah, there's nothing scarier for me than a PR with just a less than and then a less than changing it to a less than an equal. Like that is,
and like no test change at all, you're like, bullshit.
Yeah, that's right.
You guys have double equals?
I know some people that wrote that code by work.
It's not our code base. Yeah, if you know like data providers in PHP unit as well, so you can like create just like one test and then have arguments that are passed into that function, have an annotation, and like declare a separate function that is all those test cases. That is where kind of infection kind of pushes you towards, because that's usually the code that you write tends to be small, composable, very basic inputs, very basic outputs to cover the summary of it. And then because it's like, if you've got a core that depends on the core, that's all mutation tested, you kind of get you don't have to test everything all at once necessarily. It's a bit easier.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
The concept that we have is like the core is like functional code, so like it doesn't have any mutations that it does, mutations in a different sense of the word, like it doesn't modify objects or write to the database or change files. Literally just takes data in, does some shit like date maths or determines if the user that you have has the permission to do X, and then it returns something. So then writing a test is super easy. You don't have to do mocks, you don't have to scan shit other services to pass in, or you know, to access the database and the fixtures and that sort of stuff. You just pass in like a user and a file and says, can the user download this file? And it does a bunch of stuff to determine if the user can.
Interesting. Also mocks are evil.
Mocks are evil. I have code that I wrote.
I promised opinions.
The first code that I wrote was like managing the writing files to S3, and I couldn't test writing to S3, so I wrote a mock, and it's the only mock in our code base. I hate it, but I can't get rid of it because I need to mock out the thing that writes to S3, otherwise it just doesn't work. So
Why do you hate mocks so much?
Interfaces and stubs usually work much better. It's just from experience. I tend to find that when you write a mock, you're basically reverse engineering what they are doing in PHP unit mock builder sort of thing that doesn't have static analysis behind it. And most of the cases when people try and use mocks tends to be like, I've got a class that has dependency A and B, and I mock those A and B. And then when A gets called with this method, it should return this. And then you go look at your code and you look at your test. And if you get a mirror and put it up to your test, it looks exactly the same as your code because you just written the same thing just in reverse. And that's the sort of thing that I don't really see much value in, because at that point, you're not looking like at a user's level. You're looking at like a developer's level writing code. Like the stuff you're writing is literally the reverse implementation. So stubs usually better because you're basically kind of reverse engineering it, but like that unit is itself, like how it works and how it operates in its own little thing, putting in spice, that sort of thing instead. Interesting. Yeah.
I'd like to hear that talk too.
That's yeah. Also hiring engineers. So if you want a job, come talk to me. Cool. Well, I guess that kind of wraps up the night. What's the time?
it's just gone out.
All right. Good time, I guess. Well, thanks everyone for coming, especially given it's a pretty average and classy weather. Last one for the year. We will have one in February, March sort of thing. Obviously not January because it never really works out timing wise. Look forward to seeing you then again, and hopefully, pending COVID restrictions and stuff, things get even easier and it's easy to have a bigger night. Obviously, the big thing we were looking forward to back tonight was having people back in person again, and kind of the OG social bit of having beer and pizza, which we've missed for quite a while. So I hope you had a good night. I don't know when Liam's going to get us out, but
there's essentially no time. But,
Oh.
well, we have finished this, so.
That's true, that's true. But
Um,
stick around and have a chat, so talk to you. Thanks for coming along, everyone.
Thanks, Internet.
I don't know how it works.
Before everyone goes, Tom, would you like to draw the winner of the JetBrains voucher? Don't look, don't look.
My name's not in it. Tim Lawson. JetBrains voucher?
JetBrains voucher. Yes.
Very nice. They released, like, tease a new.
Cat programming.
Well, that's kind of the fleet is like yesterday. It's like yesterday afternoon. Which is like a name of like 10 other tech products as well. It's like it's supposed to be a VS Code equivalent. So it's like I don't think they're marketing it as an IDE. It's like a.
No, they are.
It's just sort of.
It is a text editor that can expand out to being an IDE.
So you can flip the IE on and off, so you can speed or.
No, it's just kind of like VS Code, like the arguments behind it's like it's more lightweight than PHP Storm, for example, which like takes like 4 gigabytes of RAM per second.
And then you can turn on IDE.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of, I think, the angle they're going on this. But notably, WebVS Code is an Electron app, like Slack, and just about everything else on the computer that just eats all the memory. This is like a Java, like desktop application. So should be quite performant. So good optimization between Electron and PHP Storm, both of which consume supermassive memory. Yeah.
And